I am pleased to introduce Dr. Mark Lewis. He is currently Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technology Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank focusing on technologies critical to the future of national defense. Mark's had an excellent career with a number of stops along the way. I'll just give some highlights here. So you've got his PhD, all of your degrees, I think, at MIT, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. 320, more than 320 publications, advisor to more than 60 graduate students, former chief scientist of the Air Force, has been at Institute for Defense Analyses, and then shortly is the new CEO.
You're the first one to see that title.
Yeah, so technically you said it's next Monday, but we thought, close enough. Of the Purdue Applied Research Institute. So, hypersonics expert, and you're going to tell us all about hypersonics.
I am indeed.
In an hour. So
yeah,
I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well,
thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to come and talk about my favorite subject, hypersonics. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a mix of technology, science, but also some current politics, because that factors very much into the field. So I will. Oops. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to dispense with the usual definition of what hypersonics is, because I'm going to assume just about everyone in the audience has an idea. Hypersonic flight is flight in excess of about 5 times the speed of sound. You always have to say about, because there's no fixed definition for hypersonic. Unlike the transition from sonic to subsonic to sonic to supersonic, the fundamental physics of aerodynamics and the fundamental physics doesn't change dramatically. Hypersonics is just the high end of supersonic flight, where certain effects start becoming important. Chemistry becomes important. Heat transfer becomes important. Shock waves are pressed very close to a slender body, and all those features are something that we as a community have been pursuing flighted hypersonic speed. We've been pursuing for actually many decades. So I want to start with the basic question: why would you want to fly at hypersonic speeds? And the answer is sort of obvious. If you've ever flown from Seattle to Sydney, Australia, you'll understand immediately why you would like to fly at hypersonic speeds. Right? There are a lot of advantages to moving at high speed. Certainly, a lot of commercial interest right now. There are companies that are claiming to pursue hypersonic flight for commercial applications. Ultimately, space access. You can use hypersonic systems to give you airplane-like access into space. But really the focus for the last several decades, and the big current focus today, is on the military applications. I've got an object that can fly at hypersonic speeds in the atmosphere. Then not only, that's bad, not only is it fast, but it can use aerodynamics to be maneuverable. And it can also operate at altitudes that are particularly difficult to detect and to stop. So that means that a hypersonic system is a very survivable system. So for example, if I'm building a missile, if I make it a hypersonic missile instead of a ballistic missile, I make it something that's operating in the atmosphere, it's much more likely to penetrate to its target. Therefore, you can see the obvious interest in military search. Difficult to detect a hypersonic vehicle that's launched, difficult to track it, especially if it's maneuvering. Again, if it's operating at the altitudes at which these things like to operate. There could be ambiguity in purpose. In other words, I don't know what that thing is. It's flying at me at really high speed. It's maneuvering, it's banking, it's diving. I don't know where it's going. That could be a bad thing. And I'll emphasize that when something is moving that fast, it's really difficult to stop. Not impossible to stop, but really difficult to stop. So even if I can see it, even if I've seen it launch, I've identified it, I've tracked it, with all those steps, this could still be a challenge to stopping it. Hypersonics kind of gives you a rapid response against, time-sensitive target. You want to hit something quickly. You want to do it at the highest speed possible. It gives you some interesting alternatives. People sometimes ask from a military standpoint, "Ooh, this sounds like it's really escalatory. I'm going to invest in these new technologies, new weapons. It's going to lead to an arms race." In fact, I'll argue it's quite the opposite. It gives you some strike alternatives to things that you would never ever want to use. You never ever want to be in a situation where you're depending on a nuclear solution. And in Air Force parlance, and for new members of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, you will hear the term often used, OODA loop. What is an OODA loop? It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. It's how the Air Force thinks about the decision process. When you identify a target, decide what it is, figure out what you're gonna do against it, and then take that action. And so you'll often hear the saying, get inside the opponent's OODA loop. That just means you are moving so quickly. You are so hard to figure out what you are. They're so hard to figure out where you're going. That someone can't even decide what they're gonna do to counter you. So all those features, as you can imagine, makes hypersonics a particularly attractive area to invest in. All right. So for the title of my talk, I mentioned, you saw the title, This Time It's Different. And the reason I say that, for those of us who've been in the field for many, many years, we have observed that there is a funding periodicity, a funding and programmatic interest periodicity in the field of hypersonics. So I'll take you through some of that history. The first human-made hypersonic object was a sounding rocket launched on top of a V-2 rocket that had been captured from Germany. Launched in 1948, it was something called Project Bumper. The sounding rocket hit a little bit above Mach 5, almost Mach 6. And so that makes it the first official human-made object. Interestingly, that was done at White Sands, and after they did a couple of those flights, most of which failed, they decided they needed to find a new location. So the Air Force decided to locate at a new launch site in Cape Canaveral, Florida, which was the origin of what is now Cape Kennedy. After those launches, some experimentation, then the 1960s hit. And throughout the 1960s, we were flying a vehicle called the X-15, the X-15 rocket plane. If you've been to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., if you've been to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, you can see an X-15, an incredible program. They built 3 vehicles. They flew them throughout the hypersonic flight corridor, 199 separate flights, piloted by some very, very famous pilots, including Scott Crossfield, but also Neil Armstrong. And a couple years ago, there was a movie made about Neil Armstrong's life, and it actually opens with the scene of him flying the X-15 rocket plane. Fast forward a little bit, in the 1980s, there was work done at the Department of Energy National Labs. We get into the mid-1980s, and the United States begins a very, very extensive program called the National Aerospace Flight Program, NASA, the vehicle given the designation of X-30. NASA was supposed to be a hypersonic airplane that could take off from any runway, fly up into space, do a mission, deliver a payload, and then come back and land on a runway. In order to do that, NASA would have had to have flown up to 25 times the speed of sound. It was envisioned to use a type of engine called a scramjet engine, a supersonic combustion ramjet engine. And with the hindsight of about 40 years of history, we can look back at that program and think, what were they thinking? It required so many impossible scenarios. It required at least 3 or 4 miracles to ever make happen. At the time, the government spent something close to about $3 billion on the NASA program. They finally pulled the plug in it when they realized that building the airplane would cost about $12 billion. So in the interest of not throwing good money after bad, the program got killed. As one example of one of the problems of the NASA program, when they originally envisioned the vehicle, it was going to be about a 35,000-pound vehicle. At the end of the program, they finally killed it. It was a 450,000-pound vehicle. And for those of you who understand, aerospace design, weight usually translates to the cost. So very expensive program. It got canceled. When it got canceled, the bottom fell out of hypersonics until we get to the early 2000s. NASA flew a vehicle called the X-43. X-43 was a demonstration of a supersonic combustion ramjet. It was a subscale vehicle, about 12 feet long. It was launched on a rocket. It dropped off a bomber. It showed sustained supersonic combustion to propel a vehicle with thrust greater than drag in the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. So I usually call that the Wright brothers moment in hypersonics. That was the moment when we knew the technology came together. And then a few years later, the Air Force flew a vehicle called the X-51. X-51 did something very similar to X-43. It was a subscale vehicle. It flew at Mach 5, so a little bit lower Mach numbers than X-43, but it did so for a sustained period of time, over 200 seconds. So it showed that you could not only build these things, but you could fly them for long duration. So I call that the Charles Lindbergh moment. Now, if you notice, I've drawn this chart and the line is going up. It's going way, way up. Because starting in about 2016 onward, there's been a significant investment, a reinvestment in hypersonics. And let's talk a little bit about that. So, in a year ago, November, the General Accounting Office did a survey of all the current hypersonics programs that were currently funded in the US government. And they came up with a list of over 70 programs across the field. For faculty members, take notes. That means there's lots of funding available in the area of hypersonics, lots of dollars flowing at everything from the very fundamental level all the way to the advanced level. The key programs were actually real production programs. So the US Navy has something called the Conventional Prompt Strike Program. They're working with the US Army on that program. The US Air Force has a program. They had a program called Arrow, and now have a program called HACM to deliver a hypersonic cruise missile. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has a number of programs in the field, including something called the Tactical Boost Glide, we'll talk about in a little bit, and the HAWK program, the Air Breathing Weapon Concept program. Then there are the fundamental efforts. AFOSR, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, part of the Air Force that invests in basic research, has a pretty robust hypersonics portfolio. The Office of Naval Research, also the arm of the Navy that does basic research, they're investing in the field as well. Big development. In 2019, the department set up what was something called the University Consortium for Advanced Hypersonics. I believe the University of Washington is a member. Right now, it's standing in over 100, I think over 100 universities and over 100 industry partners funded in this consortium. And here the goal is to have university faculty members working from the direct relevance to the major efforts that are underway. A lot of international effort in hypersonics. The Australians have a long history in the field. So the US is working with Australia in a couple of programs. There was an earlier program called HiFire. Now there's a program called SciFire, which is a small scale flight demonstration program. And then adding to that, the Missile Defense Agency, working with something called the Space Development Agency, is working on the problem of how you defend against hypersonic systems. You see something that's hypersonic, how do you stop it? What are the methodologies that you can apply? And as I mentioned, it's really hard to do. All right, so where does all this interest come from? And the answer is that right now, there is arguably a hypersonics arms race. And it comes from several countries, but the ones that the US monitors most closely, China and Russia. Now, Russia has gotten a lot of attention recently because the Russians have actually used their hypersonic weapons in Ukraine. The good news is they haven't worked very well. And most likely because the Russians are building really crappy weapons. So good news for the world, good news for Ukraine. But it's shown a willingness to use these high-speed weapons. The Chinese have deployed systems. We don't have any deployed systems, so we don't have any weapons delivered yet. The Chinese have deployed systems, and in fact, in 2019, they did a parade down their main street in Beijing where they were happy to show off the hypersonic weapons they built. So, kind of zeroing into those two countries, you see another picture of the China parade where they showed off that their hypersonic missile, the DF-17. As an aside, I can tell you, I was in a lot of meetings where we would stand and stare at intelligence, we stare at pictures of this weapon, but gathered from remote distances and trying to figure out what the thing looked like. And then in 2019, they took away all the mystery. They just rolled it out on a parade and showed the whole world, said, look what we have. Russia, as I mentioned, they've been using them in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin himself has been boasting about his hypersonic weapons. Notice he likes to combine hypersonic with nuclear warhead, which is really, really, really bad. And so, as you can imagine, when you've got peer competitors who are investing in this area, it gets a lot of attention in the Pentagon. All right, so let's talk about the technology, and in particular the technology being pursued today with those various programs. And really, hypersonics comes down to two fundamental ways to design your system, and it all comes down to the propulsion system. I can use a traditional rocket motor to boost up to very high speed. Usually I'm overspeeding, so I'm getting up to maybe Mach 10. Then I separate a glider off the front of the rocket, and that glider continues to move at hypersonic speed. It can bank, it can maneuver, and it can reach some target. The other option is to do an air breathing system. By air breathing, we mean we have an engine with an inlet Air comes in the front, it's got oxygen. That oxygen burns with fuel inside some type of engine to produce useful thrust. The X-43 program and the X-51 program that I mentioned, they were air breathers. The National Aerospace Plane, the NASA program from the 1980s that got canceled, that was also an air breather. So a lot of technology investment in that area. All right, so let's step back and say, what are the differences between those two approaches, those two technologies? This is a chart that was first produced by a gentleman named Tom Curran in the early to mid 1980s. Tom was the chief scientist of the propulsion directorate of the Air Force Research Laboratory. And he just plotted out the specific impulse, which is the thrust you get divided by the rate at which you consume fuel weight versus Mach number for various propulsion systems. Anything about specific impulse, for those of you who haven't had a propulsion class, specific impulse is best thought of as bang through the buck. That's how much thrust you get given an amount of fuel that you consume. And you can see rockets all hover down below about 400 seconds, the units are seconds, of specific impulse. So best liquid rockets we built have specific impulse values of about 455, 460 seconds. The theoretical limit of a chemical rocket is about 520 seconds. Compare that to turbofans, turbojets, they do much, much better. For the very simple reason that for those types of engines, those air-breathing engines, they're not carrying oxidizer. So for a rocket, when I divide my thrust by the fuel that I'm consuming, within my fuel, I'm considering both the fuel and the oxidizer. When a space shuttle takes off, most of the weight of that shuttle is actually oxidizer. On a turbofan, I'm only dividing the thrust by the fuel that I carry in my tank. I'm not including the oxygen that's coming in front of the inlet. So not surprisingly, air breathers give you much higher specific impulse than rockets. As you go up the Mach number scale, the available specific impulse of an air breathing system gets smaller and smaller. So ramjets are less than turbofans, less than turbojets. The engine we think is the engine of choice for flying above Mach 5 is the supersonic combustion ramjet, it's scramjet. And you see it has a much lower specific impulse than these lower speed options, but still higher than the rocket. A better way to think about it is, if I'm not carrying oxygen with me, if I'm sawing the oxygen through a hole, then the only thing I'm carrying, the fuel, is just the fuel itself, not the fuel plus the oxidizer. So I can go further in a tank of gas. So that's the advantage, and that's why air breathing is of particular interest. All right, so how do I do that? Quick little cartoon about various propulsion options. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with jet engines operating at low speed. At some point, you start hitting Mach number limits in the performance of a jet engine. The Mach number coming into the front of a jet engine at the inlet starts to become too high. Compressors stop working very effectively. But that's okay. We've got a solution to that, something called a ramjet. And a ramjet, I get rid of the moving parts, I get rid of the compressor, I get rid of the turbine. Air comes in the front, it compresses by slowing down. So I get a pressure rise feeding into a combustor, where I mix fuel, that fuel mixes with the air, it burns, expands out the back. Turns out that ramjets hit a Mach number limit. They don't work at low speed because there's no air going in front of the engine. There's no ram effect, no pressure rise. They also don't work at high speed. And I'll show you in a moment why that is. So we have to go to another engine concept, which is called a scramjet. It's an idea that's been around for a while. In fact, it was first invented in the late 1950s. But this is what we think is the engine of choice for high speed. All right. This is a classic curve for the specific impulse versus Mach number for a ramjet engine, shown in solid line. This is from Karabov's classic textbook on aircraft propulsion. And one of the things you note is, as I mentioned, a ramjet produces no thrust at Mach number 0. Because there's no pressure rise. There's no ram effect, no pressure rise. You can't get useful work out of the engine. As you increase your Mach number, you get a pressure rise. You can get useful work out of the engine. Ramjets typically operate above Mach 1. They don't work well below Mach 1. But then you get to this point where, as you get a higher and higher Mach number, a ramjet stops working. And the simplest explanation for that is that when the air is coming into the ramjet, it's slowing down. It's decelerating. At some point, it decelerates to the point where the static temperature is equal to the combustion temperature, which means the air is now as hot as it's going to get if you burn fuel. So you don't release any energy by the additional combustion of fuel. You don't release energy, you can't produce useful work. There's no thrust. So the solution to that is you never slow the air down completely inside the engine. You keep it moving at high speed. And if that happens, you can continue to produce thrust at higher and higher Mach pressure. So that's the theory behind the scramjet. And it's something that honestly I've spent most of my career working on in various incarnations. Now, remember, scramjets don't work at low speed. So what do you do at low speed? Well, if you want to build an airplane, for example, that takes off from a runway at Mach 0, flies through transonic to supersonic, then hypersonic, you need to combine engines in some way. You need to combine cycles. You have an engine which is a scramjet as part of its flight and another kind of engine at other parts of its flight, or you do multiple engines, a low-speed propulsion system or a high-speed engine. Various takes on this, various concepts have been proposed. But in most cases, we usually would combine a turbine of some sort from low Mach numbers with a ramjet and a scramjet for higher speed operation. All right, so with that in mind, if I gave you a list of all the propulsion concepts for hypersonic flight, it actually would be a long list. All right, I mentioned rockets. That's a simple one. We know how to build rockets. Ramjets almost get there, but not quite. Scramjets, combined cycles I just mentioned. There are other engine concepts, liquid air cycle engines, where I use really, really cold fuel to condense air, make it liquid air, and then burn it like a conventional rocket engine. And then every couple of years, someone comes up with some new plasma magic where they're going to ionize the air and accelerate electromagnetically and magically extract energy and put energy back into the flow. And they never work, but they keep kind of coming back as ideas. Other things I have to ask about hypersonic propulsion system: what fuel do I use? In the days of the National Aerospace Plane program, it was argued that the vehicle would only work if we powered it with hydrogen fuel, because hydrogen gives you the highest specific impulse. The problem with hydrogen, it has to be stored as a really, really cold liquid. So not an ideal fuel for operations. Conventional hydrocarbons are really nice because they're storable. We know how to work with them. You can go to any airport. They're jet fuel. The problem is that they don't burn really fast. Hydrogen burns very fast. Hydrocarbons not as fast. So if you're building an engine like a scramjet engine, you want the fuel to burn as quickly as possible inside the engine. So working with hydrocarbons is a little bit more challenging. We've tended to focus most recently on what are called endothermic fuels. That sounds like an oxymoron, right? An endothermic fuel, that's a fuel that's absorbing energy. That doesn't make sense. You know, endothermic fuels are fuels that can soak in heat before they burn. So you've got a fuel that's really good at soaking in heat, say from an engine, from a structure, and then you dump it into the engine combustor. And when you burn that fuel, it releases not only energy of combustion, but the energy that you absorb in cooling the structure. So very exotic stuff. Sorry, with propulsion, with understanding that propulsion is challenging. Here's my eye chart of every other technical challenge we have in building a hypersonic vehicle. And I'm gonna make a confession that I've been showing this chart since about 2002. So this chart is over 20 years old. It hasn't changed very much. So I'll show you we've made progress on almost every single one of these categories, but there's still a lot of progress left to be done. Right? There are still ways that we can optimize these systems. But if you look at those challenges, they fall in several categories. One is getting the engine to work and integrating the engine with the vehicle. Hypersonic vehicles tend to be very slender. It means the front of the vehicle is the inlet, the back of the vehicle is the nozzle. So I've got to design an engine that integrates well with that inlet, the inlet forebody, with the nozzle aft body. And if I don't get the flow field right on those parts of the airframe, it could have really bad effects on the performance of the engine. Understanding chemistry inside the engine. On a typical scramjet engine, the residence time, the amount of time that air spends inside the combustor, is about 1/1000th of a second, a millisecond. So you've got a millisecond, the time the air enters the front of the engine, the time it goes to the back of the engine, in which to inject your fuel, mix it, and burn it efficiently. That's quite a challenge. Lots of aerodynamic effects on the outside of the vehicle. At hypersonic speeds, you get really hot. So handling surface temperature is really important. Sharp leading edges, especially, get very hot. You need a sharp leading edge if you're gonna fly through the atmosphere for a long period of time, so you've got to handle that. Understanding the basic physics, what happens in a boundary layer at hypersonic speeds, still a big unknown. What happens when a shock intersects with another shock wave at hypersonic speeds, still a big unknown. And so really, really long list of fundamental problems that will keep us all in business for some time to come. So let me zero in on a couple of those, especially related to propulsion. And this is kind of slightly self-oriented, how life has changed in the time that I went from a graduate student to where I am today. Right, so I graduated with my PhD in 1988, and at the time, we had a list of all these problems that we thought were almost insurmountable. We didn't know if you could actually build a scramjet engine that would operate at any Mach, let alone Mach 25, which the folks running the National Aerospace Plane wanted to do. We didn't know what would happen if a scramjet engine flying at high speed, designed with a relatively weak shock wave, suddenly disgorged a normal shock wave. It's called an engine unstart. And when that happens, you get a sudden pressure rise. Thinking in time was the engine would actually not survive that phenomenon, that the engine would blow apart. We didn't know if you could even inject fuel and mix it at high Mach numbers. We didn't know about boundary layer transition and heating. We're pretty good at characterizing when boundary layers transition from laminar to turbulent at lower speeds, not so much at high speed. Didn't know the effects of inlet distortion. We didn't know if you could even control a hypersonic vehicle. There are all these fundamental questions. You know, if the engine is so coupled with the performance of the airframe, what happens when you maneuver? What does it do to the engine? All right, if I pitch up, do I suddenly lose thrust? Things like that. We didn't even know how to design fully integrated systems where I had really high lift over drag ratio, which I need for long duration cruise, but also propulsion plants that integrated have. We didn't even know what the inlets for those vehicles should look like. Should they be square? Should they be round? Should there be something in between? I'll fast forward to where I think we are today. So first question, scramjet. Yes, we run them. Well, not to Mach 25, probably never to Mach 25, but we run them at Mach 5, we run them at Mach 7, we run them at Mach 10. Those scramjets work. Turns out engine unstarts, at least under those conditions, they've happened. The vehicle survive. And indeed, under some circumstances, the engines actually restart and go on powering the vehicle very nicely. Fuel injection, yes, well, if the scramjet worked, then you were able to inject fuel, mix it, and burn it. Leading edge, a lot of work has been done on leading edge heating, lots of fundamental work, applied work. Boundary layer transition remains an unknown category, and so a lot of work underway in that area. But what we've essentially learned is we have to design against our unknowns. So if we don't know where the boundary layer is going to transition, then we have to take that into account in the design. Although there have been some programs that got stuck trying to do that, and on and on. So the list is actually pretty good. We've made a lot of progress. Let me talk about some of the key programs that made that progress. So earlier on, I talked about the X-51 program. But first, I'm going to start with the X-43 program. So X-43 was a NASA program. It was a small scale vehicle, about 12 feet long, mounted on a rocket. This is a Pegasus rocket from what was then Orbital Sciences Corporation, now part of Northrop, dropped off the wing of a B-52 bomber. And in 2004, they did 2 flight tests on X-43. Each one of those flight tests lasted about 10 seconds. But for those 10 seconds, they produced thrust greater than drag with the scramjet engine. First test at Mach 7, second test at Mach 10. That's the Wright brothers moment, the Kitty Hawk moment that I was referring to. What I love about this is it came 46 years, almost the day, after the idea of that hypersonic propulsion system, the scramjet, was first proposed. You had 2 researchers working. It was then the Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory, their relation, Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio, now the NASA Glenn Research Center, Weber and McKay, and they did this fun little paper, which is this thought experiment. They started with a ramjet engine, and they did the thought experiment of what would happen if, instead of slowing the air down inside the engine, I kept the air moving at supersonic speeds. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work, because they essentially established all the fundamental underpinnings for all the work that came subsequently. But 46 years later, we actually got their theoretical concept for work in practice. Here's X-51. That flew in 2010 and again in 2013. The first flight was at about Mach 5, 143 seconds of powered flight. So that was quite remarkable. Two flights followed that were failures for stupid reasons. Actually, the second failure wasn't exactly a stupid reason. The third failure was a totally stupid reason. It didn't go off the vehicle. Fourth flight, 2013. So almost exactly, actually, it is exactly 10 years ago. 209 seconds of supersonic combustion ramjet powered flight at Mach 5.1. Now, after this incredible success, what did the United States Air Force do? This is an Air Force Research Lab program. What did they do? Did they build on that success? Did they continue investing? Did they build more X-51s? No, they stopped the program. They actually flat out canceled it. And they all high-fived and went home and said, all right, we've done that. And the result is that the very next time that we flew a supersonic combustion ramjet was in 2021. This is the DARPA Hawk program, which is the technological successor to the X-51. You'll notice it looks somewhat similar. It's got a rocket booster that gets it up to speed, and the rocket separates. Instead of a squared inlet on X-51, it's now got a round inlet, because we think that's the better way to design inlets. First flight was in 2021. Second thing about this is that Hawk has now become the baseline design for something called HACM, the Hypersonic Advanced Cruise Missile. And that's going to be a real US Air Force program. So it took us a while. It took us some breaths, a lot of handwriting, but we're kind of getting there. All right, so now let me get to the tough love part of the field. And this is where I get to yell at my colleagues in hypersonics for what we've all collectively been doing wrong. I started out talking about the inconsistent funding cycle in hypersonics. That's bad for several reasons, not the least of which is it impacts the workforce. In the days of the National Aerospace Plan, there was tremendous ramp up of workforce in hypersonics. Companies were hiring, universities were investing. I was in that wave. Then that all went away. And I had a lot of colleagues who got out of the field. A lot of that investment was lost. Right now, in fact, in the last few years, most of the companies working in hypersonics have been trying to hire fast and furiously, and they're finding it difficult. One of the reasons we're so excited about the UCA program that I mentioned, the university program, is helping to reinvest in the workforce. We've had a lot of oversold concepts. The National Aerospace Plane, and something called the aerospace plane before it, single stage orbit vehicles flying at 25 times the speed of sound. Those become oversold and it ruins the credibility. We made some poor program choices. This is one that I'll get to in a little bit more detail, but we just haven't flown enough stuff. We have about a 50% failure rate right now for the various flight experiments that we're doing when we do them. And it's because we don't do it often enough. So if you don't fly stuff, you don't get good at it. We failed to follow through. So X-43 was a tremendous success. NASA achieved Mach 7 or Mach 10 flight, and then they canceled the program. X-51, tremendous success, as I mentioned. We fly to Mach 5 on hydrocarbon fuel, cancel the program. There's also tended to be something called next programitis, which is as soon as we get a success in one program, instead of building on that program, we decide, all right, let's move on to the next thing. And you saw that with the DARPA Hawk program. So instead of continuing to build and evolve X-51, say, oh, we're going to build something completely different. And then, of course, the last thing that gets us, our nation is a democracy. We re-elect people re-elect an administration every 4 years, and congressmen every 2 years, and senators every 6 years. And in the military, general officers tend to serve for about 2.5 to 3 years. So there's a constant turnover, and whenever a new person comes in, they say, well, why are we doing this? And why did we invest in this? So that tends to slow us down somewhat. All right, now, having said that, let me highlight one of the more exciting things that seems to be happening, and that is private investments from outside government. And I'm going to highlight two because I'm actually involved in those two, so you would have changed yourself from my opinion. But one of them is a company called Stratolaunch. Stratolaunch is owned by a company called Cerberus Capital that is run by a gentleman named Steve Feinberg. And Steve bought the assets of a company that had been originally of targeting air-launched rockets to orbit. It was a brainchild of Paul Allen. Paul Allen wanted to build the world's biggest airplane and use it to launch rockets into space, which is a really attractive idea until you do the details, and it turned out not to be such a great idea after all. So Paul Allen died, sadly, and his family didn't want this company that he invested in anymore. So they sold off the asset, and it was bought by Cerberus Capital Management, and they decided to repurpose this airplane for hypersonic testing. So they now have the world's biggest airplane, the biggest airplane ever built by Wingspan. It wasn't the biggest by weight. The biggest by weight was in Ukraine. The Russians blew it up, unfortunately. So now it is the biggest airplane by wingspan and weight on the planet. It's essentially the size of two 747s glued together with a center wing set. And the idea is to use it to launch hypersonic flight test beds. The airplane has been test flown a number of times. These flight test beds are actually have been built and are sitting in a hangar, and their first anticipated flight is going to be September of this year. Now, the fun part about that is they essentially want to do a wind tunnel in the sky. So these small hypersonic test beds will have acreage where you can do experiments, you can do material experiments, you can do sensor experiments, you can compare it to ground test experiments. So that's one example of investments. If they're successful, they'll have something that is repeatable and reusable. You can fly it at hypersonic speeds and you can get it back. That's really important. I'll show you another area of investment, and that is people putting their own money into wind tunnels. Traditionally, the government has been the primary source of funding for wind tunnels, but a number of organizations and companies are stepping up to invest in wind tunnel infrastructure. Purdue University, which is going to be my employer as of a week from today, has exotic plans to build something called a hypersonic ground test complex. It'll be a big wind tunnel complex, and they're looking for private investment from industry to help them make that happen. A little bit of investment from government, but mostly from industry. The idea is build it and they will come, which is to say the government will step up to the plate. All right, let me shift to another aspect of hypersonics, and that is supply chain. And this is something that I've been involved in very, very recently at the National Defense Industrial Association. We decided to do a look at what supply chain you need if you're going to build hypersonic vehicles in large numbers. And we looked at critical raw materials and goods. We looked at how you manufacture these things. We looked at vulnerabilities. Can someone mess up your supply chain? And then we looked at the importance of international partnerships. We teamed up with my old employer, University of Maryland. They've got a supply chain management center, and they did a deep dive across the board. There are some unique materials that get used in a hypersonic vehicle, high temperature materials, for example, that come from around the world. So that was one of the key areas that we focused on. Manufacturing. So today, most of the concepts for hypersonic vehicles involve the use of additive manufacturing. We're not really good at large-scale bulk additive manufacturing, so that was something else that we identified. And we came across with a couple of recommendations. First, we kind of told the DoD what should be a blinding flash of the obvious, that you need to have consistent demand signals in industry. There's lots of people in industry tell us, every 15 years, the bottom drops out of this field. So if you want us to invest and build our own wind tunnels and build up our workforce, you need to be consistent. We found vulnerabilities in critical materials. We found that the supply chains today are inadequate to sustainably field the numbers of weapons that the DoD would need. We found that the manufacturing base is insufficient to support fielding large numbers of these things. And we put a really strong emphasis on the importance of working with friends, partners, and allies. I mentioned earlier the Australia partnership. It's a big part of what the department is doing. But that becomes absolutely important, not just for intellectual capital, not for just for capabilities, but also to secure our supply chains. All right, so let me close up by posing some remaining questions. All right, first, the obvious one: is it really different this time? Will support for hypersonics continue? Well, if you look at the way the government's been budgeting so far, the answer seems to be yes. The FY22 showed a significant ramp up in funding in the field, and then the 23 budget came out and was even better. So that's kind of good news. You hear good comments coming from Pentagon leadership. Heidi Chu, who is the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering in my old office, has been very supportive, as has the Deputy Secretary of Defense at Hicks. The House of Representatives set up something called the Hypersonics Caucus, which is to promote hypersonics. So but I think it's pretty safe to say, yeah, this time it's different. There's been some recent skepticism. About a year and a half ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists wrote a paper attempting to debunk the value of hypersonics. I have suggested it as recommended reading for all graduate students in the field because it is so technically flawed in so many ways. I'll give you an example. They decided to model a hypersonic vehicle. So they found an aerodynamic model from a Chinese publication of a US configuration that we flew and it didn't work. And that was their, by the way, the model was wrong. So it was the wrong model and the wrong configuration. And then the folks who wrote that paper flew the vehicle at -4 degrees angle of attack, which is hilarious. And so all the results were wrong. But it got published by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, and got a lot of attention, unfortunately. I've already addressed the issue of defense industrial base, test infrastructure. So I'll wrap up on that point, which is if we're going to pursue this area, if we're going to continue to advance at the rate we need to be advancing, we need to be building lots of hypersonic test facilities, ground test and flight test. Today, if you would like to test one of those supersonic combustion ramjets at full scale, you have two choices in the United States. You can go to NASA Langley and test in something called the 8-foot hypersonic cup. Or you can go to the Arnold Engineering Development Center in Oklahoma, Tennessee, and you can test in a facility called Aptitude, the Advanced Propulsion Test Unit. And that's it. Those two facilities are so oversubscribed that if you wanted to do a test today, you would be told you would have to wait a minimum of 9 months, or more likely 2 years, depending on where you want to burn. Now think of the implications of that. So let's say you're lucky enough to get your test and you run your test and something fails. You lose a transducer, your sting fails, whatever, and you want more testing time. Sorry, you're out of luck. They're oversubscribed. Or let's say you do your test and you see something really interesting. And by gosh, you need to do 2 or 3 more tests to nail down this new phenomenon you think you saw. Sorry, you're out of luck because there's someone lined up right behind you getting ready for their model as well. So it's a bad situation that we're in right now as a nation. And so unfortunately, the Department of Defense is attempting to address. So my ultimate slide is kind of the where do we go from here? So I maintain that we need to continue the efforts right now on the DoD side in hypersonics at scale. What does that mean? That means not doing 1 or 2 flight tests, not having a program here, a program there, but actually delivering this as a real capability. Hypersonic cruise missiles, other hypersonic systems in sufficient numbers that they have some meaningful impact. Ultimately, though, we want to move beyond weapons, reusable systems, aircraft, manned or unmanned, military missions and commercial missions. The military mission, you can imagine, sensing, intelligence gathering. The unmanned missions I alluded to at the very beginning of the talk. Continuing to work on propulsion systems that get us to those reusable systems. Things that combine scramjets and turbine engines in some way. And then maybe even some alternative flow paths. And I'll highlight the work of a company called Reaction Engines. They're a company that started in the United Kingdom about 35 years ago. It was a brainchild of an engineer named Alan Bond. So while we were trying to build a national aerospace plane with Mach 25 scramjets that we don't think we could build today, Alan Bond had a different approach. He wanted to use a liquid air cycle engine. Okay, had on my list of engines earlier. And the way his concept was going to work, he'd have really cold fuel on board the vehicle. We've got an inlet, air comes in, it's chilled by the cold fuel, and you condense it. You now have liquid air. You separate out the oxygen, and you burn that oxygen with some fuel, say hydrogen, in a relatively conventional rocket engine. Lots of advantages there. You don't necessarily have to develop a whole new propulsion concept. All the technology actually is invested in the heat exchange. You need something that can circulate in very full liquid, capture air and condense it. And so today, the reaction engines company is building these incredibly efficient, highly effective heat exchangers that can rapidly condense air. And they figured out, by the way, that if you build a really efficient heat exchanger, there are lots of applications beyond just hypersonic flight. Cooling things, cooling aircraft, cooling anything that gets hot becomes an attractive market. So that's an intriguing alternative. Reaction engines is opened up a US branch. They're headquartered in Colorado right now, looking to push that technology. Then ultimately, access to space. So imagine if I could build a hypersonic vehicle along the lines of that National Aerospace plane, the X-31, that really could take off from any runway and really could fly up to space and deliver payload and do a mission and then land again. I'm pretty sure you can't do it with a single stage vehicle, but you might be able to do it with a two-stage vehicle. And think about what that would mean for the way we operate in space. It would essentially create an airplane-like model for space operations, as opposed to the rocket model that we use today. And that's kind of an exciting goal, not one that I think we'll see in my lifetime, but maybe in my grandkids' lifetime. No, I don't have grandkids yet, but so that's kind of the dream, and it comes back to the National Aerospace plane. They kind of had the idea right. They were just maybe a couple of decades too early. So with that, let me open to any questions. And by the way, that's a real photograph of the Stratolaunch carrier airplane. So these are it's got a dual fuselage. It's got a center wing section. For the hypersonic test, they mount a pylon onto that center wing section. You see human beings to scale. This thing is absolutely enormous. Every time I go visit this airplane, I'm in total awe. My favorite number is, so the X-51 and the X-43 vehicles were both launched off the wing of a B-52 bomber. This airplane can lift so much weight, if you cut the wings off and stow them, you could actually carry a B-52 bomber underneath that wing. So pretty interesting construct. It's a Burt-Rutan design. So with that, haven't taken any questions.
Is that in Mojave?
That's in Mojave, yeah. So this is the Mojave spaceport, outside of Palmdale, California. So they're right next door to Virgin Orbit and some of those other new space companies. And they test out of Mojave, fly out over Point Magoo to Navy Point, and then head out over the Pacific. Now, I will tell you, for the aircraft designers in the room, there are some really interesting perks in this airplane. So it was designed by Burt-Rutan. For those of you who are familiar with Burt-Rutan, very famous airplane designer, but he has his preferences. He doesn't like digital controls. So the original design of this airplane, all the controls were analog, including cables and pulley. Interesting design choice. He used a lot of pieces off of 747. So the cockpit is basically a 747 cockpit. The engines are basically off of a 747. It's an amazing thing to watch fly.
They're cycling.
Yes.
That's a really interesting
Yeah.
concept, but you're flying hypersonic.
Yes.
So basically you're hot.
Yes.
The stagnation temperature is very high.
Yes.
If you're going to be liquefying all this air, how do you sink all the heat?
So so the idea, Alan Bond's original idea was to use hydrogen fuel. So he's got liquid hydrogen as his heat, so he's sinking it into liquid hydrogen. And you're right, I'll tell you the other challenge, which is, if you work through the numbers, you need to ingest a certain mass of air to use later in flight. So you often find yourself flying around. You're not going to, let's say, for instance, you want to fly to orbit. You find yourself flying around a lot to build up your oxygen supply, so you've got enough fuel that will allow you to continue on your way to orbit. There's another fundamental problem, which is if you're using a rocket engine, say, as your propulsion system, the maximum velocity you get coming out of a rocket is gonna be a little bit less than 5,000 meters per second. In order to get to orbit, you need a delta V of about 9,000 meters per second. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there. As a result, you wind up having to store mass on board as you're flying. And that's also bad because it defeats the whole purpose of being an air breather in the first place. So the company that's doing that, as I said, Reaction Engines, they kind of lowered their sights like everyone else. So that's their vehicle right there. It's called Skylon. For many reasons, that's a really bad design for a hypersonic vehicle. They're really an engine company though, and they lowered their sights. So they're looking at ways to use that engine cycle, say, in much smaller scale systems. It winds up being a nice bridging system, by the way. So if you combine their heat exchanger technology with other engine cycles, you can essentially do it as a pre-cooler on a jet engine, for example. So you can essentially trick an engine into thinking it's flying at a lower Mach number. It's another way to kind of push up the Mach scale. Other questions?
Do you think we'll see one? Well,
Ooh, it all depends on which one.
or the reaction engines.
Not in a foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And not for technical reasons. So there was originally a lot of technical skepticism about the liquid air cycles. One of the other problems they encounter, by the way, is when you fly into the atmosphere, there's moisture in the atmosphere, you've got a really cold heat exchanger, it tends to ice up and become less effective. They've come up with some intriguing technology. Essentially, they do a chemical coat on their heat exchanger that prevents ice buildup. So they made it through that first skeptical point. Their big problem, and I hate to say it, is because they're a UK-based company. So they opened up a US subsidiary. Full disclosure, I'm actually on their advisory board, so I try to help these folks. But they're still seen as a UK company, and so they've had trouble tapping into US funding, especially from the Department of Defense, which is really stupid, especially since, last time I checked, UK is one of our best allies, but they're just not eligible for funding sources that other countries are have available.
Okay, so the funding they received so far is not quite getting.
Yeah, not right there. Yeah, so the British the home office has gotten reasonable funding from the British government and from the European Space Agency. They've gotten some private investment, including some investment from Rolls-Royce, for example. The U.S. company, which they set up to tap into U.S. markets and to meet the needs of the U.S. military, hasn't been as successful. And everyone says, "Oh, that's a really great idea. We got to fund it, but we don't know how to do it," which again is really stupid.
Do you think laser weapons will get a lot more funding as these hypersonic vehicles get deployed?
So laser weapons are already getting a lot of funding. So I'm not actually a big fan of trying to use lasers against the hypersonic system. So let me go back to my picture. Almost. Okay, so let me go back to my picture here. So that's a pretty good representation of a boost glide system. We're building them. China has already built them and deployed them. Russia has built them and deployed them. And essentially, the way this thing is working, it's boosting on a conventional rocket. It's overspeeding. So it's going to a higher Mach number than the air breathing system. Right? Let's say my air breathing system, the previous is designed for Mach 5, maybe Mach 6. The corresponding boost glider that's going to do a similar mission is overspeeding to about Mach 10 in that range. Then it's separating off the rocket and it's gliding, losing energy as it goes. So it's slowing down, but still remaining hypersonic. All right. So the key there is I designed this thing to handle the heat load corresponding to Mach 10 glide. Now, when am I going to use my laser? Well, I'm probably going to use my laser towards the end game, right? So this thing is coming at me and I want to shoot it down with a laser. When I'm hitting it with a laser, it's at the least thermally active portion of its trajectory. So I'm trying to hit something with lots of energy that was designed to handle Mach 10 or above. And it's, by the time I'm hitting it, it's maybe Mach 4, maybe Mach 3. So what can I do? Now, there are people who say, oh, we're gonna hit it with a laser, we're gonna knock off pieces of the thermal protection system. I don't think so. I think unless it was designed by really, really bad engineers, there's not a lot I can do. Now, I don't want to be totally dismissive. There are a few things I might be able to do. If it's got sensors, I might be able to do with laser and blind the sensors. If it's got electronic components, I mean, it might be able to do, magic energy weapon that disrupts the microelectronic components. Maybe if I hit it with a laser, I can induce the boundary layer to do something that it wasn't expected to do. Maybe. So, yeah, that's why I call it an arrow that should be kept in the quiver, but it's not the way you really can stop this. So, if you're going to stop something that's barreling in at hypersonic speeds, I mean, you got a couple of options, really. One is bullet with a bullet. So I shoot something that hits my hypersonic missile, which is possible to do. It's challenging because classic control theory tells me that the interceptor has to have about 3 times the maneuverability as the thing I'm trying to hit. So I need, 3 times the G. So if this thing can maneuver at 15 Gs, I need a 45 G system in order to stop. Not impossible, but a challenge. I can try to use the thing's energy against it. So for example, you'll hear people say, let's put up a wall of metal. It's back to World War II and we would shoot flak and try to, hope that the airplane was flying in the flak because it's, going over the target. We do the same thing here. You shoot enough material into the air that when this hypersonic thing is barreling through at high speed, it hits whatever, the energy is such that it's static. Lots of other approaches. The bottom line is it's doable, but again, it's probably really difficult. My favorite one, by the way, my favorite solution to stopping these things, both categories, is something called left of launch. So left of launch, I do something that prevents them from launching it in the first place. And you hear this in the Pentagon all the time. We're going to do left of launch. I like to remind people that the abbreviation of left of launch is LOL. and the reason is left of launch means I do a cyber attack on my opponent, right? I get to their system, I somehow prevent them from launching it, which means my opponents had to be, once again, kind of stupid. They had to leave vulnerabilities in their cyber system that I was able to exploit in some way. And maybe they did. I'm not sure I want to count on that. And by the way, there's no way to test that. So I don't necessarily want to be using my system for the first time when something really hot and sharp and pointy is playing it. But that's just it. Other questions? I know I'm a little bit over time, but I started late. Are they going to kick us out of here? No.
We're here till 5:30, but if people need to leave, you're welcome.
I'll consider it very rude, but you can tell. Yes.
Well, I like the commercial spin off, so
Yes.
I'd love to be able to fly from Seattle to New Zealand in
Yeah.
2 hours instead of 14.
Yeah.
So, but you have the fueling problem. I'm
Yeah.
curious about, hydrogen's a great fuel, but you need big tanks and
Yeah.
storage issues. Hydrocarbons is a good fuel, a little heavy for, but it's expensive. And you put the plot of specific fuel consumption up, it's a business.
That's right.
What are your thoughts on the economic viability?
Oh, gosh.
That kind of mission.
Yeah, so right now, there are actually 2 companies in the United States that are pursuing supposedly commercial hypersonic systems. That's in addition to the companies that are pursuing commercial supersonic systems. So the 2 companies that I know, there are probably more, but the 2 that I know, there's a company down in Georgia called Permius. They've gotten a lot of publicity in hypersonic systems. Then there's a company that's been much quieter in Texas called Venus Aerospace. And the fundamental challenge I see is in order to build a full hypersonic airplane, you would need an investment of billions of dollars, not millions, billions. So the National Aerospace plane program that I quoted, it got stopped when everyone realized that to build that thing was a $12 billion enterprise. Arguably, a point-to-point transport would cost less than saying it's flying up to orbit, but you're still flying about saying it's multiple billions of dollars. Those companies, if you go to their websites, they tout all the money that they've raised, they've got venture capital, they've even got some government investment on the order of tens of millions. So they're off by at least 2, maybe 3 orders of magnitude in order to get into this. So that to me is the first question. And then there's the second question, which is, so the vehicle, so there are huge sunk costs on the vehicle. Then of course, maintaining these things, they're going to be maintenance nightmares. Think about what goes into maintaining a conventional airplane now, an airplane that's going to be flying at Mach 5, maintaining a thermal protection system, maintaining an engine system. The recurring costs, I think, will be horrendous, absolutely horrendous. There's the other problem, and it's the problem that a Concorde faced, which is the best aerodynamic shape is not the most volumetrically efficient shape. It's hard to get a lot of people onto supersonic transport. Again, translate that for hypersonic vehicle. I don't think you'd ever get enough passengers on board to make it worthwhile. So it's one of these things that I desperately would love to see a commercial hypersonic airplane. I just don't see a case for it. I'm even going to confess I'm not sure I see the case for the military hypersonic airplane. And the reason is that, so you used to think it would be a great reconnaissance platform. I fly at Mach 6, I can snap pictures, no one can shoot me down. Mach 6, even at Mach 6, someone can shoot you down. You've got a really expensive thing that is vulnerable. So I'm not even sure about that. That one I think is more likely than the first.
These companies have any idea what state ticket price is going to be? Concorde, exorbitant.
So if they do, they have to say this. So, this gets back to my tough love slide. I talked about the field of hypersonics has tended to suffer from overblown concepts, which has hurt our head very well. So without naming names, if you go to the websites of these companies, they're really enthusiastic. And they think they've solved all the problems. In at least one case, one of the companies has on their website that they've solved all the science problems, it's just engineering. So I haven't seen any quotes of a ticket, but I don't see how you get the price of that ticket down. I just don't. Maybe you project 100 years and we've built them and flown them and we've gotten really good at it, and the price of the ticket is now something that everyone can afford. But I just don't see it. By the way, as there is a reasonable argument to be made, a reasonable question as to whether there is a market anymore for high-speed flight. And I mentioned there are a company, and I don't want to get too far off the topic of hypersonics, but there are companies looking at commercial supersonic flight again. And when I was at the Institute for Defense Analyses, we did a deep dive for the White House on the commercial viability of a supersonic airplane. And we had a lot of folks opining that there wasn't a market anymore, even if you could build the airplane, make it economical, carry enough passengers. And one of the more compelling arguments that I've got was, in the days of the Concorde, you got on an airplane, and when that door closed, you were isolated from the universe. And World War III could have broken out, there could have been a zombie apocalypse, and you wouldn't know until that plane landed and they opened the door. Now you get on your airplane, you log onto their Wi-Fi and you're on the internet and you're working happily away. So is there that pressing need for high-speed transport today that we thought we had in the 60s and the early 70s? I don't know, but I'm going to admit to being a little bit skeptical. Again, I'd love to see it. Nothing I'd love to see more than a supersonic airplane, right? Well, hypersonic airplane.
All right. Why don't we give everybody a chance to get some.
Sure. I'll hang around. I'm here if you want to hang around.
Thank you again.
Thank you.